G'day, my name's Rick, and I want to talk about cypress, which is a timber you might want to use in speargun construction. Back when I was a boy, we used to call it Murray pine, but nowadays it's called native cypress, which is probably a better name for it. Cypress is a softwood timber with a lovely sort of orange colour and a very attractive grain pattern. The cypress we see here in Victoria is a native tree, a native softwood. The most common softwoods we see around here are basically pines and cypresses. But the main difference is in the fruits. A pine has a pine cone, and a cypress has a smaller nut which is round until it starts to open up to let the seeds out. Cypress leaves are quite distinctive too. But the cypresses that you see growing outside really aren't the ones that turn up in the wood in the lumber areas. The native cypress is a Calyptra species, and it's a smaller and differently shaped tree. The cypress that you get from hardware stores is basically used for either poles in gardens or building of gazebos or fence pickets. It's a very durable outdoor timber. Most softwoods are not very dense, but native cypress is perhaps a little bit more dense than most, with a specific gravity of somewhere around about 5.5 to 0.6 of water. The timber we see seems reasonably stable, but there's often a lot of knots and bits and pieces and unusual grain in it, which makes me wonder if in fact it would stay completely straight if its internal water content changed. The knots are reasonably tight and there's not much in the way of gaps around them, although there can be some, but they still compromise the integrity of the lump of timber. At the end of the timber you can get checks and cracks, which is probably due to unequal forces when the timber's drying. You can see a bit of a check there, maybe there, and I certainly wouldn't trust that stuff around that particular knot there. Certainly not for any structural purposes. Cypress is an oily timber, and this is probably why it's so popular for outdoor uses. Oily timbers can sometimes pose problems for gluing. Not that I've ever heard of any joint failures. But then again, my experience isn't all that broad with this timber. You can get native cypress at most hardware stores. Mostly it comes in the form of square blocks for posts and that sort of stuff, or in the form of fence palings. I've certainly had no trouble finding any in Bunnings. So, how good is cypress in speargun building? Firstly, I'd have some concerns about how good the gluing is. If I was going to glue it, I'd be gluing it with epoxy, which would probably have a greater affinity for the oiliness than, say, perhaps some of the other high-end PVAs. The presence of a lot of knots makes me a little bit iffy about its dimensional stability. So if I was going to use it for a stock, I'd have to make sure that I used a lot of thin lambs. I'd say laminates of about 10 millimeters, and build them up to make the stock. Also making the stock, I'd have to take into account the fact that this is quite a brittle wood. It's very easy to knock corners off or to chip bits out of when you're working it. Freshly cut, it's got a very distinctive smell, which is probably something to do with the oiliness of the timber. Where it does come into its own is that it's got a lovely pattern and very, very easy on the eye, very, very good looking. So, cypress and speargun building, well, my first choice wouldn't be to use it for a stock. But because it looks so bloody great, I reckon for trim, it's got real, genuine possibilities. And for handles,